Puppetmaker's curse. I wasn't supposed to be there that day. The antique market wasn't my scene, too dusty, too cramped, and full of people pretending to know more about history than they did. But Mia, my best friend and roommate, dragged me along, claiming we needed character props for the upcoming theater showcase. "Just look around," she said, tugging me through the crowded stalls. "You never know what you'll find." That's when I saw it. The marionette was tucked away in a corner booth, hanging from a hook like it had been forgotten. Its wooden face was unnervingly lifelike, with delicate features and glass eyes that seemed to glint even in the dim light. Its strings were tangled, yet something about it drew me closer. "How much for this?" I asked the vendor, an older man with a face like crumpled parchment. He glanced at the marionette and hesitated. "That one?" His voice lowered. "You don't want it." "Bad luck." I rolled my eyes. "Bad luck? Really?" The man leaned in, his breath sour. "It's cursed, miss. Belonged to Viktor Voss. You heard of him?" I shook my head, but Mia, who had appeared behind me, piped up. "The Puppetmaker? He was, like, super famous in his day. Disappeared mysteriously, though." "More than disappeared," the vendor said darkly. "He cursed his puppets before he vanished. They say they hold pieces of his soul. And those who cross them, he trailed off, shoving the marionette toward me. Take it, if you're so curious. I'll give it to you for free. Just don't bring it back." The marionette sat on my desk, its glass eyes catching the moonlight through my window. I hadn't meant to bring it home, but the vendor's ominous words piqued my curiosity. Besides, it was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, too good to toss aside. "Creepy as hell," Mia said as she peeked into my room. "But it'll make a killer prop for the show." That night, I dreamed of strings. They stretched across a dark void, pulling at my arms and legs, twisting me into unnatural shapes. A voice whispered my name, low and rasping, as though from far away. When I jolted awake, the marionette was still on the desk, but its strings, which had been tangled, now hung perfectly straight. I told myself Mia must have fixed them, but she swore she hadn't touched it. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. The marionette would appear in different positions around my room. I'd leave it facing the window, only to find it turned toward the door. At night, I heard faint tapping sounds, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the floor. "You're psyching yourself out," Mia said when I mentioned it. "It's just an old doll." But it didn't feel like just an old doll. One night, as I was dozing off, I heard it, a faint, raspy voice. "Lily." My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The marionette sat on the desk, unmoving, but the voice came again, quieter this time. "Beware, the strings." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Slowly, I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, flooding the room with light. The marionette was still in its place, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. The next morning, I noticed a new detail on the marionette. On its wooden base, just below the initials VV, were small scratch marks, like someone had clawed at the wood. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I spent the day researching Viktor Voss. The stories about him were varied and grim. A reclusive genius, he had been a renowned puppet maker in the early 1900s, crafting lifelike marionettes that performed with uncanny realism. But his fame turned sour after accusations of witchcraft and dark rituals. According to legend, Viktor vanished after a devastating fire consumed his workshop. Some said he died in the flames, others believed he had cursed his puppets to seek vengeance on those who wronged him. Why would someone curse a puppet? Mia asked as I read her the articles. Maybe it wasn't just a puppet to him, I said, staring at the marionette. Maybe it was, a part of him. That night, I dreamed again. This time, I saw Viktor himself, a gaunt figure in a soot-streaked apron, his face half hidden in shadow. He worked feverishly at a puppet, his hands moving with inhuman speed. When he looked up, his eyes were cold and lifeless. "They stole everything from me," he whispered. "But I'll make them pay." The next morning, Mia was gone. Her bed was untouched, her phone left on the nightstand. Panic set in as I searched the apartment, but there was no sign of her. The marionette sat on the living room couch, its glass eyes glinting in the morning light. Draped across its strings was a scrap of fabric, the same color as the scarf Mia had been wearing the night before. My heart raced as I picked it up. "Mia?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The marionette's head tilted slightly, just enough for me to notice. I backed away, grabbing my phone to call the police, but the screen flickered and went black. The lights in the apartment dimmed, and a familiar voice rasped through the air. "You cannot run from the strings." I fled the apartment, clutching Viktor Voss's journal and the marionette. Every instinct screamed at me to toss the puppet into the nearest dumpster, but something told me it wouldn't help. The curse wasn't just in the marionette, it was in me now, tangled up in strings I couldn't see. My research had led me to an abandoned workshop on the outskirts of the city, the place where Viktor had supposedly vanished all those years ago. If there was any hope of breaking the curse and finding Mia, it lay within those crumbling walls. The workshop was a crumbling relic, its roof sagging and windows shattered. The air inside was heavy with dust and the faint scent of charred wood. The marionette seemed to grow heavier in my hands as I stepped inside, the whispers growing louder. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding a lifelike puppet frozen in grotesque poses. Their glass eyes glinted in the dim light, following me as I moved deeper into the building. At the center of the room stood a large wooden stage, its surface scorched and splintered. "This is where it ends," I whispered, setting the marionette down on the stage. The journal described a ritual to release the trapped souls from Viktor's cursed creations. It required a fire to purify the puppets, along with a recitation of the final words Viktor had etched into his journal. "The strings shall sever, the souls shall free. No master shall remain but eternity." As I prepared the fire, the marionette began to move. Its limbs jerked and twitched, its head snapping up to look at me. "Lily," it rasped, its voice sharp and menacing. "You don't understand. Viktor's curse isn't just about vengeance. It's about survival. Destroy me, and you'll unleash something far worse." I hesitated, the journal in one hand and the matches in the other. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I've seen what lies beyond," the marionette hissed. Viktor's soul was fractured, scattered into his creations. "If you burn me, you'll tear open the veil between this world and the next. Do you think you can handle what comes through?" The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the darkness, shapes twisting and writhing just out of reach. The marionette's words rang in my ears, but I couldn't let fear stop me. Mia was gone, trapped by this curse, and I couldn't leave her to whatever fate Viktor had designed. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, striking the match. The marionette screamed as the flames engulfed it, its wooden body writhing as though alive. The other puppets on the shelves began to shake, their glass eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The room filled with a cacophony of voices, screaming, laughing, and crying all at once. The shadows surged toward me, and for a moment, I thought the marionette had been right, that I had made a terrible mistake. But then the fire roared brighter, its light pushing back the darkness. The puppets on the shelves crumbled into ash, their voices fading into silence. The marionette was the last to fall, its glass eyes shattering as its wooden frame disintegrated. When the fire died, the workshop was silent. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me since I found the marionette was gone. "Mia?" I called out, my voice hoarse. At first, there was no response. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw her. She was curled up on the floor, her eyes wide with confusion. "Lily," she whispered. I ran to her, pulling her into a hug. "You're okay," I said, relief flooding through me. "It's over." But as we stepped out of the workshop into the morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The fire had destroyed Viktor's creations, but the darkness I had glimpsed in the shadows lingered in my mind. Weeks later, life seemed to return to normal. Mia and I moved to a new apartment, far away from the cursed marionette and the memories it carried. But at night, I still heard faint whispers, like strings brushing against wood. One evening, as I unpacked a box of old theater props, I found something I hadn't packed. A small wooden figure lay at the bottom of the box, its glass eyes staring up at me. On its base were two familiar initials, VV. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. In the distance, I thought I heard the faint sound of laughter, cold and echoing. The curse wasn't gone. It had simply found a new puppet master.